Hello, it's Neil Dougan here. I'm just wanting to introduce to you the book which I've created, and it's a book based on my experiences with autism. So I grew up as an autistic, or within the spectrum at least anyway, and had many issues in growing up. As you can tell by looking at me, I'm not a young man, and at the time when I was growing up, there weren't too many ways that these types of things could actually be diagnosed, and there was certainly no support really available in schools for the condition that I had. Even so, as a child, whilst I was really struggling with school and with adapting to circumstances to do with relationships and so on and so forth, I could already begin to actually identify some very unusual gifts that were actually sitting inside of the autistic experience that I was having, and I began to explore them even as a child. All through my life I've actually been further exploring and further understanding how these things are operating, and the book is based in large part actually on my own journey, my journey of going from a place of being completely overwhelmed, so absolutely no ability to manage the stimulus that was coming into me, to a place of thriving. So at the tender age of 60 as I am now, I'm at last in a place where I can actually thrive despite the fact that I'm sitting in the spectrum. So the clues to the superpowers were there, as I say, from a young age, and over the last 10-12 years I've been working increasingly with patients who are in the spectrum, so a whole range of spectrum expressions. And what I've found is that there's some tremendously consistent themes occurring within the spectrum. And I should point out that I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not trying to replace the role that a medical doctor actually plays. So when I'm talking about these things, I'm looking at it from the perspective, from the inside, from the inside experience of a spectrum individual who has found his way into a situation where he's actually working with thousands of autistic patients. First thing in there is that actual recognition. So being able to recognize that there is at least the hints of superpowers actually lurking. And in that, there is a tremendous sense of relief, because something which has been so confusing to you all through your life, you've had these hints of incredible things that you're capable of, but they've merely been hints. They haven't actually been expressed in some way that can be measured, and certainly not measured by a school system or an employment structure or any of those types of things. And for that matter, it's been looked at as being in a way of not actually fitting in even into normal society, so even outside of the workplace and schools and so on. With that recognition that something unusual is possible, outside, so we already know that there's something unusual happening because we're not the same as everybody else in the community, but that there is something unusual and special actually sitting in there. There comes this tremendous sense of relief, and I can't begin to express how much of a relief it is to people within the spectrum. So once my patients, once they actually get to recognize that there's a gem sitting there buried, there's a whole bunch of gems in fact actually buried there, and the relief in them is just extraordinary. So along the way, as you begin to actually develop these superpowers, and obviously the book is based fundamentally around understanding what's happening inside a what I call a spectrum event, and I know that that's not the commonplace way that a doctor would talk about these things, but certainly in my what I recognize with myself and with my patients is that enough triggering occurs and an event actually happens. So we get a triggering coming in, there's enough overwhelm occurring, and then there will be an event, what I call an autistic spectrum event. And again, I apologize to the psychologists and the doctors who might be watching this. I know that this is not the normal way that that you talk about these things. In that process, this sort of process along the way, what comes out of it is this beginnings of a recognition of how the triggering is also actually stimulating what amounts to the seeds of the superpowers. So whilst you're in the middle of having, some kind of, to an outsider, a breakdown, so like you're just failure to function, whether it be something as simple as not being able to respond to a demand, or, paranoia, or that type of thing, or, sadness, deep sadness, and these sorts of things which actually spring out of the experience. Being able to actually identify that in that moment of the autistic experience, that event, autistic event, you're actually also triggering off the superpower. So becoming aware of the fact that the very experience is actually contributing to the great outcome is extremely useful. And the comfort and the respite that people feel, we're talking about my patients here and myself as well, like I'm no different. Once I started to recognize that I was getting into this unusual gift territory at the same moment as I was in the depth of the so-called disability. And of course, as you're going along the way with that, as you get more comfortable, more confident in yourself, and everything begins to actually work a little bit better for you, you actually are navigating and developing coping strategies. So all of the coping is beginning to actually occur. So I was capable of actually eventually getting through a couple of degrees and holding down jobs and that type of thing. It was very, very difficult for me to hold down jobs because because of the spectrum, where I was in the spectrum, it made it very, very difficult to hold down jobs. And to fit in generally, people would say to me, well, when have you ever fitted in? And I have to agree with them that it's not really how you would describe me. But along the way, there's lots of coping, developing, and many of the approaches that would be made by a psychologist or a doctor or, through medication in cases, and certainly lots of therapy, what's fundamentally being worked on is the coping strategy. So being able to actually cope with what's going on. And what I've found working with my patients is that by focusing in on the superpowers, so in other words, establishing the tremendous good that can actually come out of the condition, the coping strategies are much more naturally available to you. So without having to focus in depth on the actual strategies, like the help strategies that a psychologist or a doctor might be providing to you, psychiatrist for that matter as well, you are necessarily through that sort of self-healing process actually getting to a point of coping. Where you reach that tipping point, you eventually get to a tipping point where you're outside of just merely coping and you're actually beginning to thrive. Then the expression, like the so-called negative expression of the spectrum, is inevitably actually declining. So you're getting less and less and less of the so-called negative expressions of the spectrum. So I see that we're already up to 8 minutes there on the video, and I don't want to bore you for too long. But please have a look through the the documentation here on the page, and I'm quite sure that through the process of actually exploring and developing your own superpowers, that you're going to find a way, a way through just merely coping into a place where you're thriving. And I'm living proof of it, and I've worked with thousands of clients, the majority of whom have actually made their way through to a place of thriving. Their place of thriving might not look exactly the same as another person's, but for them, they are thriving, and they really are thriving, doing really well in their lives. So thanks for watching, and please read on.